today's presentation, we have a lot of different presenters today, and they'll be introduced as they start the presentation. I'll just take you through an overview of what we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to be introducing just the basics of what peer assessment is. And then Chris Shun is going to, from University of Pittsburgh, is going to spend some time answering your questions about the research on peer assessment and what it can tell us. Then we're going to move into examples from 4 different colleagues from universities and CJAPs who've been using peer assessment in their classrooms, and they're going to walk you through what they do and what they've learned from it. Finally, we're going to summarize some of the best practices, discuss the challenges with the panel that the people that I've already mentioned, and also taking your questions, and then we'll just have an open Q&A at the end. So feel free to contribute questions whenever they arise in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you prefer. So why peer assessment? What are we trying to do with that? Oh, and you should see a poll pop up. I just got it. That's just to help us understand who's here. So please feel free to answer that when you have the time. So why peer assessment? So anyone who's taught has probably encountered something like this cartoon on the slide. We know that we can spend a lot of time writing feedback to students, hours and hours marking certain things, and we don't see the results from what we're doing. We often feel like our time is being wasted and the students aren't learning as much as we think they should from our feedback. Similarly, we're usually discouraged that students aren't understanding what we're expecting of them. They don't seem to get the criteria and the standards of our course and of the discipline. So these are things that peer assessment can help us with. So a definition of peer assessment, there's a lot of different definitions out there, but we're taking this approach from Topping. It's an arrangement for learners to consider and specify the level, value, or quality of a product or performance of other equal status learners, so of their peers. So the mechanism by which students engage in peer assessment is by providing feedback to each other. This is usually reciprocated. They give feedback to peers, peers give feedback to them. Peer assessment may involve assigning grades and ratings, but it doesn't have to. It can just be qualitative feedback as well. The benefits that peer assessment offers us as teachers is the amount and the quickness of receiving feedback. It takes us a really long time to provide every student with quality feedback, but they can get it a lot faster from their peers and a lot more of it. It's also been shown to improve student engagement in the course, in the assessments, improve the quality of what they're submitting, and it's also been shown to enhance group work in general as they learn to work and trust with each other. And lastly, it opens up a new way for us to assess and understand what our students really know as they engage in these higher order processes, judging, evaluating, discussing. So it allows us to see a lot of their critical thinking more than you would. There's also benefits for the learner. Okay, when properly implemented, peer assessment can increase students' learning in a whole range of areas. So in the subject matter, the material that you're teaching, it helps them engage and learn to self-regulate their own learning much better. It allows them to better understand the standards and criteria of the course. And it also allows them to become more familiar and experienced with the culture and the discourse of the discipline as they learn to speak the language. So that's it for the basics. I'm going to open up to Chris Shun from the University of Pittsburgh, who has done a lot of research in peer assessment and peer feedback and is going to take over from here.
Thank you, Phoebe, for warming us up. I have a little McGill symbol. That's where I did my undergraduate work, and I was a from the West Island and I went to Marianopolis. And 2 of my nieces currently attend John Abbott. They might be enrolled in one of your classes. So I have a very strong personal connection. I've been obsessed about peer review peer feedback for about 20 years now. And I want to start with what your questions are, because once you get me going, it's hard to stop. So what are your questions? Chime in, put them in the chat, and we'll go in that direction. There is this terminology thing. I saw a comment about the peer review and peer assessment and peer feedback. You know, there's kind of just synonyms, but the assessment side emphasizes the numbers. The feedback side emphasizes the qualitative comments, and peer review usually means the combo pack of the two. How much time do I spend correcting peer feedback? You know, this is a very interesting strategic topic. In my own teaching, I do almost zero of it. I have sort of an introductory training, and the system I use flags students who seem to be out of alignment with everyone else, and they get some automatic feedback on that regard. So I'm currently teaching a class of 250 students, and they will do 4 assignments with lots of feedback, and across those probably 5,000 comments that are going there, I'll probably look at 100 that I've been asked to step into, and the system kind of runs itself. Whoop, we got a...
Chris, I'm just going to unscreen share for you so people can see you, but if you prefer me to go back, I will.
No. It's fine. All right. So if you switch to, I gave feedback on 20 documents or 100 documents, and now I give feedback on 4,000 pieces of feedback, you'll never win that game. That's just crazy talk. The purpose of peer feedback is for students to learn from the giving of peer feedback. And so some light sampling to see where things are, you know, what the mood of the crowd is, and kind of trust in the process is the move you're trying to get to. So you're not Grand Central Station anymore, and students are working with students is sort of where you're trying to get to. And I think some of the later talks, the later presentations are going to get into the strategic elements of things. How much can we implement this in a university course? You know, the learning opportunity of the giving side is where the research says most of the learning happens. So when people first start doing peer feedback, they think about it as like cheap outsourcing. Like, I'm tired, can the students do my work for me? And all the research comparisons they're interested in is how much worse is the comments the students give each other than the one that I would have given them, right? It's sort of the outsourcing idea. And the answer on that side is their ratings, if you average across multiple students, is more reliable than your rating and just as valid. And collectively, the comments that the peers make are more persuasive than your single comment. But all of that, from the research perspective, is like missing the main point. It's not the receiving side, it's the giving side that is the better learning opportunity. And maybe instead of feeling guilty about outsourcing, you should feel guilty about all the times that you previously gave feedback and you prevented students from learning via giving feedback. But I went on a fair amount about this. Can you provide an example of one of your own introductory peer assessment exercises? I think you can think about it as introduction to the set of expectations. So you're in a course, you have a certain number of expectations, and starting with fewer dimensions, fewer things that you want to attend to is a good place. I wouldn't start with kind of the lowest demand expectations, like spelling and grammar, and then grow there. In part, the reliability on spelling and grammar is a little bit lower than on other things, and it's just boring as hell. It's like a terrible learning experience. I would instead start with the deeper thinking things, but just fewer of them. The places of the broader dimensions, like if you're trying to think about rigor of evidence that they're providing, the quality of the explanations that they're giving, the extent to which they've correctly analyzed these aspects of physics. You just kind of stay on the things that make you excited about the discipline and just have fewer of them. You don't need to treat them like babies. Okay, let's see. How do students feel about the activities? There's a lot of research on that. Attitudes towards peer assessment, and there's kind of complexities of first language peer assessment and second language peer assessment. In general, if you've got a well-structured process, students appreciate that they learned from a little bit from the feedback they got. They appreciate they learned a lot from the feedback they gave, both from looking at stronger documents, like, oh, I like how that person did that thing and this person did that thing, but also from seeing weaknesses, which they then recognize in their own thing. So, my instructors always said that boring writing was terrible, and I didn't believe them. And now I understand why boring writing is terrible. I also made this mistake. So they learn from that side. The thing that is often the hang up is expectations of workload. If you try to ask them to review too many documents too quickly, then they start getting angry about a cheap outsourcing kind of perspective. So there's kind of managing the workload expectations and setting the right amount of time to get behind things. And having an opportunity to talk about it in class and sort of talk through what's being expected of them before they do lots more. Because if often this is a new pedagogy to them, and there are a number of students who are just nervous about being asked to be an expert when they don't feel like they're an expert. Yes, so there's a question about references. Phoebe, at the end we have of the presentation, and people will get the presentation. There's a lot of references.
Yes, there's quite a few.
This is one of those areas where when I began it, there were maybe 3 of us in the world who were doing this. And now there are so many people researching this that in the last 5 years, there have been like 6 different meta-analyses summarizing all the research in different areas around peer assessment. It's just amazing. how much more attention there is to this approach and how they're consistently finding pretty large positive effects of peer assessment. Let's see. Oh, so there's this question of guilt of being a professor while using this method. I think we're going to get more into that in some of the later presentations. I think of it as a shift. What you used to be when you gave all the feedback is a very expensive teaching assistant. You spent all your time doing this feedback task. And now you can spend more of your time looking at what are, from the peer feedback that's being provided, what are the remaining weaknesses? Then you can become the strategic. Like the peers through their feedback were able to attend to issues A, B, and C, where they're still not able to attend is issue D and E, and now I can focus designing instruction, bringing examples into class. Like I noticed how there was a lot of disagreement about how to think about this document. Let's now talk about it together and make some progress on that. So it becomes a kind of a more strategic activity rather than Sisyphus rolling, you know, the same ball up the hill all the time. There's on the grading point. So in some of the peer reviewing systems, you can assign grades for the reviewing activities. It provides an incentive. And some of them focus on the rating side of things. Are you doing the ratings accurately? And some of them focus on comment side of things. Are you providing helpful comments? Providing grades for the helpfulness of the comments tends to have the most powerful effect on raising the quality of the commenting and the quality of the rating. It's like if you're forced to think carefully about the comments you offer, then there's a real there to the ratings that are created. So there's kind of an interesting 2-for-1 when you provide grading incentives for higher quality comments. All right. So many good questions here. The lab marking and feedback. So there's an interesting trajectory around all of this that point raises. And that is often you have a grading bottleneck to the kinds of assignments that you're willing to assign, right? Like every time you give a rich assignment that takes a human like you 20 minutes or 30 minutes to evaluate the document, you think 3 times or maybe 10 times before you're willing to give one of those assignments. Because if you're, you know, teaching 30 students or 100 students, you know, that's my whole weekend. Every time I sign one of those things, my weekend is gone. By using peer assessment, you can put in more complex assignments, including more complex lab assignments. So instead of they're only going to, you know, do some calculations and I quickly look, are their calculations correctly? They can now do a more serious laboratory investigation where they're testing a hypothesis and reporting on the hypotheses and developing some ideas and all of those sorts of things. And you can have the students engage in that deeper evaluation of this kind of richer assignments. So as you're beginning this path into peer assessment, think about the opportunities of doing richer kinds of assignments that using peer as a feedback mechanism will create the space in your kind of teaching calendar to be able to do. All right, if you ask to consider bigger questions or spelling as well as the remaining, That's actually a really interesting point raised by Susan about if you get the students to handle the big ideas like the rigor of the evidence, the extent to which someone has explained this, physics principle well or applied it in this context or that sort of thing, who takes care of spelling, grammar, and style? I think there's kind of people have found there's kind of a balance in this regard. Holding students consistently to communication standards is sort of good for everybody, and students as evaluators can judge that, right? So some spelling errors and some grammar errors, you still kind of understand what the person's trying to say, and that's whereas others, you basically lose the thread. Like, I don't understand what this paragraph's even saying because the grammar is so terrible. And holding students to that level of expectation is easy for them to do as evaluators and doesn't make your physics class into an English class, et cetera. So that's kind of a balance between the pragmatic focus of your class and what the peers would be able to reliably judge. So once you get into like obscure rules of English, and English is terrible, there's so many obscure rules. I'm not even sure all of us on this call are experts at all of the obscure rules of English. To grade these comments. So I think some of these questions will get into the pragmatics of different systems. Phoebe, should we delay some of the questions to some of the later presentations?
That would be perfect. Yep, I think it's about time to move on, but there'll be more time at the end. So the next part of this webinar is going to be 4 different people are going to discuss their experiences implementing peer assessment in their classes. We're going to start with Jackie Stewart from the University of British Columbia. In front of you now, you should be seeing a table. Now, we've created this table over the last week in discussion with the 4 people you're about to hear from. And it's a fairly in-depth comparison of the different ways in which they're using peer assessment. So is it formative or summative? Is it quite structured or is it quite loosely structured? What's the purpose of the assessment? And then what's the purpose of doing the peer assessment? And you'll notice, you probably can't read it all because the font's going to be quite small. But if you look at it on your own time, you'll see that there's a wide variability in how it's being used. And there's also some important similarities. And we're going to try to pull these out as the experts present and also afterwards. So we left this table in here so you can explore it in more depth at your own time. So Jaclyn, it's on to you now. And just let me know when you want me to advance.
Okay, thanks. And I apologize. I have a little cold, so I might be dabbing my nose a bit, but I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to tell you about a project that I did with my organic chemistry students, but that's really a means to talk about the software that I used in the end. So I didn't know which one to bring up first, but I'll tell you a little bit about this project and then about the peer assessment and a tool that we have developed at UBC, which is open source and freely available for you to use as well. So this project, I called the choice project, since students had lots of different choices. They needed to first decide whether they even wanted to do it or not. In the 2 terms that I've used this project, it was optional. But I wanted to give students the opportunity to do something more creative and connect the course content to their lives. And in my organic chemistry class, I have students in forestry and life sciences. They might be in pharmacy. They have lots of different interests. And so this was an opportunity to help them make that connection. So the assignment actually asked them to do one of 3 things. They could address the issue of chemophobia, or a fear of chemistry, in the public. They could link a part of the course to their field of study, or they could teach a concept from the course to someone with the prerequisite knowledge, so first year chemistry. So they could decide which one of those three things they wanted to do, and then they had to choose the format. So they could do a video, podcast, infographic, or a news article. And I have to admit, some of my confidence from doing this in chemistry is that I also teach science communication, where we do this in those contexts. So this wasn't too far of a stretch for me. But when I did it, I provided them lots of tips on how to do this. I de-emphasized the technology. This did not have to be, super high level editing. I provided a rubric and some examples. So that's what we did. The first term I did this assignment. Again, it was optional. I had about 450 students in the class and about 150 chose to do it. And I graded them all. It was a lot of work. I had a really detailed rubric, which I'll share with you, and it took me a long time, but they did really cool things. This is just two examples. One is an infographic on the left and the other is a news article on the right. And the most common things that they did were the infographic and the video, and they were really great. And I really thought it was a good learning opportunity, but it was not sustainable for me. Grading these 150 assignments was not very feasible. And part of my teaching goal for this was to have the class develop learning objects that I could reuse in the future. And it did occur to me that it wasn't so great that students were putting all this time and effort into creating something and only I saw it. So it was really limiting the widespread impact of these. Now, what I would probably do is help them put them in some kind of a public format as well. But I did want students to be looking at their own work. So if we go to the next slide. The next term I did this, I used something that was developed by my colleagues at the Center for Teaching, Learning and Technology, along with several faculty members, called Compare. So this tool is based on what's called adaptive comparative judgment. And comparative judgment is when people have two things and they're really only asked to decide which one is better on a certain criterion or on the set of criteria. So that's the comparative judgment. And these scholars really started to think of, okay, well, if we want to be able to use compare, both to get students to give and receive feedback, but also to help us with that summative assessment of rank ordering students' work along some kind of quality continuum, maybe the comparative judgment's a good idea because it's easier for people to use that innate ability to compare than it is for my students to use my really detailed rubric that they would need a lot of training to do. That's a totally valid method of peer assessment. This is an alternative to that. So this tool, the instructor can create the assignment and give those instructions. The students can put in their work just with the text box or upload any kind of media file. So they could upload their videos right here or a link to a private YouTube, anything they wanted. And then there's this period of comparison. And so the students who are engaging in this activity would be given several sets of other students' work and be asked to compare them on the criteria that I gave them. And then, of course, students can review and reflect. And a lot of my colleagues use this in a formative way. So let's say it's an English class. Maybe they, put their theses and their argument in this text box and then get some formative feedback and then do another version. Or if it's, math solutions, students can just snap a picture of their solution to a problem, upload it, and get some feedback this way. So this is so flexible. And all the code is available on GitHub for people to use. I'm just looking if there's anything else I wanted to say. I think, I'm not presenting a bunch of research results from my own class because, again, my activity is sort of secondary. But I think it did meet the goals of, one, giving me kind of a rough ranked order of these assessments. And so then I went in and looked at kind of every 20 or so and saw, okay, what grade might I give this? And I had a pretty high level of confidence in that rank order. And I think, like Chris was saying earlier, it allowed me to give a really rich assignment to this large class that maybe I wouldn't be able to sustain term after term after term. And again, so my use did err on the kind of summative giving a grade point of view, but many of my colleagues have used this tool for formative purposes as well. So I'm going to put a couple links in the chat, both to the tool, and I upload my assignment documents in case anyone's interested. And after the other speakers, of course, I'll still be here for questions. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Next, we have Michael Dugdale from John Abbott College Physics Department.
Hello, thank you very much. So as mentioned, I teach physics, and I'm going to describe a little bit more of a constrained sort of script, probably the most constrained one in our little series of talks. That is constrained because I was really trying to use peer assessment to address a particular issue that I've been fighting with for the last 15 years of teaching, and that is students not understanding sort of the relationship of experiment to knowledge development in science. And so, I just paraphrased the kind of conclusions we get out of our often receive from students in the in a lab report, where they're basically taking their results and testing their results against sort of the textbook thing of what you're supposed to be getting. That's sort of backwards to the way science works. In science, it's the experiment that ultimately is the determinant of fact. And yeah, it also has this sort of idea of appeal to authority, that just because something a textbook said, that you can't question it, or there is no sense in questioning it. And of course, we're not going to come up with any Nobel Prize winning discoveries in a college physics lab. However, understanding sort of how science works, how science evolves, that's sort of a fundamental element in terms of interpreting things that are coming out of science. And I use the fact that so much of the if you will, discussion around things like climate change can often be traced back to an ignorance of how science actually works. That's there. So I've been using, oops, sorry, Phoebe, could you advance, please? So I've been using a system called Perceptive, and the idea is to try and get a little bit more scientific culture into our physics labs. And doing that by, if you will, simulating the peer review process that we use, that happens in science, where the community of scientists are really the arbiters of, have you made your case, and have you demonstrated that? So I noticed in the comments earlier on, I think it was Alex had mentioned sort of a relationship between peer assessment and peer review, and I'm actually trying to leverage that quite explicitly. So within the Perceptive framework, what we do is we have the students write their lab report, and they're given a set of instructions, and they can be very, very explicit, or over the course of the semester we try and pull back on how explicit that is. They submit, there's a deadline for that. It has to be a very strict deadline, because we move to the next the next phase requires the submissions be in. And that next phase is an assessment phase, where each student is responsible for grading between 3 and 5 of their peers' assessments based on a rubric. And that rubric is something that I, as a teacher, have provided. So that assessment process goes for a time. Again, another fairly strict deadline. The students receive the feedback from their peers, and then they have the opportunity to back evaluate. And so basically, were the comments and were the ratings that the other students gave them fair and helpful? And in my context, then they're allowed to do an edit and submit the final draft to the teacher, which would be me, for most of the marks. But I'm really trying to use that peer assessment, again, to simulate a peer review process, but to also expose them to the meaning of the rubric that I'm trying to get them to use. So the nice thing about Perceptive is it's got some very interesting defaults in terms of grade weight. And the thing that I like about this is how you get marks for completing all of these tasks, right? I think that's 20% on default. You get 40% for the grade on your submitted work based on your peers. And you get 40% for the quality of the peer review that you give to other students. So you're really communicating, the importance of that. Phoebe, go to the next slide, please. So these were just a couple of the dimensions and ratings that I'm trying to use. Rubrics are not a natural language for me. I'm trying to learn them, and I'm actually trying to learn from this process to become better at producing valid and reliable rubrics. I just want to show you how I have split them for a particular lab that I did, and it was basically 3 different categories of ratings. Each one of them has one or more what we call ratings, but the language, the implementations of that in that context. So, for instance, data quality, I split between 2 sections of the report. Graph details, required elements, and follows the style guide. And the one that I'm really trying to push here is drawing the conclusions from the data. And I put both a sort of a positive scale and a negative scale. That one's getting a little bit different. This is the one that I'm really struggling with. That's the thing that I want my students to do better with, but it's coming along. Next slide, Phoebe. Thank you. All right, and this is just kind of a little bit of reflection on this. The system can give you a bit of a measure of the reliability of your scales. So how well are you communicating them? How what those meanings are? How basically how reliable is it? And you can see in this case, of those 3, it was very, very clear to the students how to assess data quality. It was very unclear for them how to work with that conclusions there, with those conclusions there. So that, as a teacher, comes back to me. I maybe either need to rethink that rubric or go back to my students and work on helping improve that. Of course, if everything came out green, well, there's also not learning anything. So it's nice to see that growth over the semester, but it's also feedback for me to alter my rubric making skills. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Next, Alice Restes from McGill University and Alice's TA, Chloe Garzon, are going to be presenting how they use peer assessment.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of the how and why. Sorry, I'll give you the why did I get involved in this, and then Chloe will give you the how, since she is my my guru in setting everything up. So I teach organic chemistry, and we all know that students dread it. It's not an easy course, and I've been trying all along to make it a little bit more fathomable for them. My first stab at it was to start giving 2-stage exams. And as a preparation for the group part of the 2-stage exam, I started using visual classrooms. And the actual tools, visual classrooms, will be described by Chloe and how we use it. Since we moved to remote learning, I have been continuing to use visual classrooms, but I have changed the way I use it. Since we do not have the 2-stage exams anymore, I'm using visual classrooms for students giving feedback to each other. So besides the idea of learning from each other, which is a mandatory part in a 2-stage exam, what I always wanted to see, and visual classrooms is amazing at letting me do this, is I want to track their thinking somehow. I want to see, okay, I know you can do this problem, but show me how are you doing the problem, right? And the fact that I can see all the steps and I can see how they draw on visual classroom makes me really gives me a view on their thinking. In organic chemistry, we draw, we talk, we say things, but we don't write words, we draw. And if you're not drawing properly and you don't know where your arrows are pointing, you might as well start from scratch. So understanding early in the course, where do students struggle, by seeing their pattern of thinking in drawing, was very helpful. And it continues to be helpful. Now, the other struggle that I always had is this idea of students always looking for an expert answer. So is this right or is this wrong? I'm going to look in the book, I'm going to look in the solution manual, I'm going to ask my prof. No, you're going to learn from a peer. You're going to have to learn to trust your peer that they might have the right answer. If not, you're going to get to the right answer together. So Chloe will take you through how we do this on visual classrooms. It is creating really a safe space where they feel they can be wrong, they're not judged, and they help each other better understand. All right. So I will pass it to Chloe, and feel free to ask us any questions as we progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe, and a little background about myself before I dive into how visual classrooms work is that I was originally a student in Alice's classroom before we began working together to onboard visual classrooms. Our goal was to use this virtual platform to enhance student comprehension in organic chemistry, a class which, as Alice mentioned, and I'm sure you all know, many students have strong apprehensions about before entering. And I also think it's important to note that while in Alice's class, I got to see for myself her enthusiasm for peer assessment and experienced my first two-stage exam. Using visual classrooms, we knew we wanted to harness the interactive aspect of the platform and build a sense of community where students could use each other to increase their understanding of the concepts being taught in lecture. So you may be asking yourself, how did we accomplish this? Simply put, we use the platform to post formative assignments which correspond to the content being learned in class. A simple demonstrative example is shown here on the screen. This concept is nothing new. However, where it gets interesting is after the student completes the assignment. Once the student has posted their answer, a switch is flipped in the program, and the student can now view all the other responses which their classmates have posted, as you can see here. Their job now is to analyze these responses and provide feedback in one of two ways. One, by providing correct feedback to a correct answer, as shown in the green box. Or number two, by providing constructive feedback to an incorrect answer, as shown in the yellow box. An example of this real time is one of the first assignments that we posted earlier this month. Next slide, baby. Students were asked to identify lone pairs, hybridization, and bonding patterns in a molecule, all of which are foundational skills which are essential to success later in the course. On the screen, I have selected some posts which demonstrate the capabilities and potency of this interactive online community. The constructive feedback is shown in the yellow boxes and demonstrates that the students were able to correctly identify the mistakes of other students' posts and bring them to their attention in a polite and informative manner. Additionally, the correct feedback is shown in the green boxes and helps to foster confidence and community within that platform. Using this method, we hope to shift the point of view from simply memorizing facts and content to a more holistic understanding of the material. Giving feedback to peers helps the students train their brain to spot patterns, which doesn't only serve them well in organic chemistry, but their other classes as well. Next slide. Looking back at fall 2020, we conducted a mini survey post-semester to see what the students thought about these methods. Through using visual classrooms as a tool to analyze and assess each other's answers, a large majority of the students stated that both receiving and giving feedback helped them to learn. And as Chris mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it's important to note that while one primarily thinks of the student receiving feedback as the one gaining more from this interaction, it is also the student giving feedback who profits. The very act of giving feedback forces the student to find a way to convey what they've learned in a foreign context and apply it to a specific principle. Overall, we have found that the continuous use of feedback over the course of the semester helps normalize the learning process and dispels the notion that failure is final. Failure, or mistakes, are essential to learning, and it is how we learn from our mistakes and those of others, which ultimately determines our success. Thank you so much for listening to that brief intro to visual classrooms, and I'll hand it back to Phoebe.
Thank you, Chloe and Alice. Our last presenter today is Anna Lisa from Dawson College Sociology Department.
Afternoon, everybody. I think I'm the lone sociologist and social scientist in this group, so
some of the lessons I might communicate or talk about might be a bit different, but I hope they're helpful. I definitely have learned a great deal just from what the other presenters have learned today. So I may be using some of these tools. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm from the sociology department. And in terms of actually thinking about why I started using peer feedback and peer assessment that have been asked so far, have gotten to that question of quality feedback. How do we understand whether or not people are actually giving constructive feedback, and how do people respond to that constructive feedback? And so we talk failure, but a big part of that aspect of productive failure is to recognize and to respond well to actually the feedback that you've been given, and to course correct. And so one of the things that I've implemented and what I'm going to describe over the course of the semester is to think about group projects that are scaffolded, and that scaffold a feedback and assessment in relation to it. And so that there are several projects that I have implemented over the course of the semester that I will go through. And the purpose of the peer feedback and peer assessment in this is to do both formative and summative assessment in relation to the course material, but it's also to deepen people's understanding and assessment, to be able to provide constructive feedback to their peers, to be able to institute accountability within the group and negotiate responses, and then also to think about how you revise and how you respond to feedback as the course continues. So this is a project that I've done in my sociology class. It's focused on thinking about community engagement. And I use case studies of neighborhoods in Montreal. And I use basically an approach that thinks about using a canvas to test ideas and use peer assessment and presentation. The software that I use is called Span-Nareva, that we've tested out here at Dawson, or at Dawson on campus, but it could be adapted to other platforms. In other words, it's not essential that you use this particular platform, but it is important to have those visual tools and some of the aspects of the canvas here that people can import ideas into, that they can share with one another, and that they can all add to as the course goes on, and that they can also share both within the group and then within the course itself. So that is people who are divided into groups at the beginning of the semester are assigned these particular neighborhoods and are associated with those neighborhoods and collecting data and information about those neighborhoods, then also forward the goals of the group and respond to the actual assignment itself, but then they can see other groups work at the same time. So they have this testing space where they can actually add to their group project, but then they can also see each other's work. And so the example that I'm going to show you on this first slide is just from a case study of the plateau, where students first added to the sociodemographics of the plateau, and then they had to analyze the food system in that in each of the neighborhoods that they were assigned to, and then they had to actually identify the 3 biggest issues. And in the second project, they deepened their knowledge and information in relation to the area that they were assigned in the case study that they had, and they had to essentially provide recommendations if they were a fictional strong mayor who had ultimate power for the neighborhood, which I would say actually is a compelling argument to some students because they like the idea of being able to decide for their neighborhood. So in terms of incentives, that was a good one. Next slide. Phoebe? I think I've lost you.
Oh. We can hear you, Annalisa. Or we could.
The joys of having internet connections that are not always as powerful as you hope they would be.
Should we give her a minute, or should we move on and come back?
Give her a minute, and maybe we can take a question or so while we're waiting, if anybody has, because there's lots of chat in lots of conversation in the chat. if someone wants to ask a question, you can just unmute.
Sorry
yourself.
about that, everybody.
Oh,
I'm back.
Just in time.
I got kicked off the platform. So this is one example of where we start in the project, where students start off at the beginning of the semester and they have their first assignment of being assigned to just collect data on their particular neighborhood and to provide information to one another. And one of the things that is the goal of this particular project is to get them used to thinking about quality feedback in the first place. So we do spend some time thinking about and talking about what quality feedback is and how it's constructed, how it can be constructive. But another goal of this is that after, when they first hand in their assignment for the first aspect of this project, is to make sure that, and this gets to the grading component of this, that they have all of their boxes checked in terms of actually the elements of the project itself. And so I can say, in terms of since starting to do this, I've never had somebody in a group project hand in something that didn't have all the required elements associated with it as part of the first step. And so what I'm going to show you is actually what the students have to do in a group-to-group manner. They first start off providing their Canvas to other students, who then actually provide feedback on sticky notes in this particular software. And then the students have to and respond to the feedback. So they talk about the feedback within their group, and they talk about whether or not it's valuable. And then they also, at the end of the day, respond to it. I'm going to turn off my camera. So if you can just advance, Phoebe, please. So this is one example of feedback that one of the groups gave. Maybe put the map sources next to the map. Next, please. Next, please.
Do you see it?
Next. Yeah. And why don't you advance the next two as well?
I think I did. I think you just have a bit of a lag. All the sticky
Oh,
notes
sorry
are
about
off
that.
now.
Okay. So good point. It would make it clear sources move from the right corner of the map. And just to be clear about this is that the students and themselves and the groups do not need to agree with the feedback, or they can say, I've already done that. So they can just, what they do have to do is respond. And then for the second project, they have to actually add and deepen their knowledge in relation to the assessment itself, as well as the assignment. And so when they actually provide content and thinking about their action plan for their case study, they then actually start to deepen their feedback to the other students and to the groups. And so you'll see from the second group project, each of the groups themselves has to provide feedback on the actual content. And so our free class is feasible. What exactly will you offer as lesson plans? And this is actually for their action plan for a particular neighborhood. And so again, they have to respond. Likely we would use volunteers to keep the classes low cost, but free would not be feasible. So they talk about the feasibility of different projects, as well as actually thinking about the content. And one of the goals for this is actually not just to actually think about the content of like the requirements associated with the project, but what the quality of the feedback and moving from essentially learning to mastery. That is, how do I think about what I'm learning and how do I actually master the material? And so this deepens their knowledge in thinking about how they both understand their own neighborhood, but then also other people's. So next, please. So finally, this is the final project. It's nice, clean canvas with their presentation. What I found essentially in relation to this is that accommodating students and deepening and scaffolding peer feedback and peer assessment over the course of the semester has increased their capacity to move from learning to mastery, but then also their capacity to be able to respond constructively to this feedback, to be able to understand and to engage in thinking about what the feedback means in terms of their group projects, but then also improve their overall competency and their overall understanding of the material in the course. And so the final one, please. So this is the nice clean version of the slide, and then a nice, at the end, presentation associated with the class about what their target and their vision is for their particular neighborhood and their plan. That is both well presented, but then also has incredible content associated with it. So those are the overall arching goals. Again, from a social science perspective, it's quite a bit different than thinking about chemistry or physics. But at the end, but in terms of the actual course itself, when I think about peer assessment, we move from group to group, and then we talk about groups, like negotiating within and between group members, moving from group back to group with revisions and responding to feedback. And then at the end, we actually talk about group to individual to talk about accountability within groups. And so that's where our rubric comes into play, where people talk about the contributions to the actual group, where there's a summative assessment associated with it. But most of the time, these are formative assessments. And my takeaway point from this in relation to this is to think about understanding engagement. And I found that the carrots and sticks question that has been brought up is really speaks to me, because I have found when students are, the more grades that I provide, the less students can be engaged in the course material, even if it's just an informal assignment. And this actually provides them with the capability of like working with one another and the capacity to respond to each other. So that's my project. I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much, and sorry about my technical difficulties.
Thanks very much, Annalisa. So I'm just going to summarize briefly some of the best practices that have emerged in our discussions in setting up this webinar, and also just from reading the literature. So we kind of broke it down into 4 best practices, which you can ask about in more detail later. One is to, when you do peer assessment, show your students that you value it, however you do that, by talking about it in class, maybe by assigning grades to it, but make it very clear that it's important that you're not just offloading the work. Of course, you have to scaffold. You actually need to teach students how to do it. I think every presenter has brought that up today. One word that's used a lot is rubrics. You need really clear, accessible rubrics that the students can use. Using it formatively. It's not to say you can't use peer assessment in a summative assessment. Jackie has actually done that before with success, but it's also usually the whole point is for it to be formative. The students can take that feedback and use it to increase the quality of whatever it is that they're assessing. And lastly, something that again, all the presenters have emphasized, especially Alice and Chloe, is this building trust between students and recognizing, helping your students recognize that they can be important sources of knowledge for each other. So we're going to move on to thinking about some of the challenges associated with peer assessment, because clearly there are a lot of challenges, as there are with any approach that we use to teaching. Here we've listed what we consider to be 4 of the big challenges with peer assessment. One is, how do you get students to trust in each other and in this process of peer assessment? How do you deal with the extra time and cognitive demand that peer assessment asks of students? I know Chris brought that up a bit, and it's probably worth a lot more discussion. How about the initial effort required from us as teachers? Everything might go really smoothly once we're used to it and it's in progress, but the planning and the starting and all of that can be a challenge. And lastly, what about the logistics? How do you make it work? Michael talked about things like deadlines, having to have pretty hard deadlines so students could respond in time with each other. It's logistically challenging, so that's also worth discussing. So at this point, we're going to open it up to our panel. So Chris, Michael, Alice, Chloe, Annalisa, Jackie, to discuss these. And the audience, if you have questions relating to these, now is a good time. Does anyone want to start with the first one, students trusting each other and in the process?
I can briefly address how we go about students trusting each other. So we have set up a system in which we have assigned moderators. And the moderators don't go necessarily by a name. They're moderator 1, moderator 2. And I'm also always in the background. So the minute students start giving feedback, we have the moderators guide them along. Yes, you're going the right direction. Start thinking about this. We never provide the direct answer unless we see that they're totally off the path. But by gently nudging between the moderators and myself, then we see that the students start, the process becomes a little bit smoother, and the students start trusting a little bit more because they know that there's somebody in the background and then they're not on their own.
Overall, it seems like a topic of community norm building, and there's a variety of ways of doing that. So it can be done as a side process where you have people checking, observing, giving feedback, or as a whole class discussion where exemplars of disagreements are brought forward and people talk about how should it be handled, was this fair. I've seen lots of different ways of solving this challenge of getting people from their previous view that only teachers may grade, only teachers are sensibly giving feedback, to this process could work too, but they're just there needs to be a way of getting them to that norm. I think Michael's waving his hand.
Well, I'm just going to add a little anecdote to that. And as I say, I'm trying to simulate sort of the peer review process in science, and many of us here will have had the infamous reviewer number 2, right, where reviewer number 1 is giving you some great review, and reviewer number 2 just seems to be so off to the side. It's our job though to sort of integrate and then maybe try and address those issues. It was really funny. We got one of those letters one day as the reviews were just being released to the students on theirs, and we were able to compare actually in class. Because one of the groups will say, my reviewer number 2 is giving me completely contradictory information to reviewer number 1, and just sort of able to sort of pull up the letter that was addressed to us on having exactly that same sort of structure, I think was something telling, or able to communicate in a very authentic way that the responsibility as the researcher in science or in social science, right? It's to try and integrate that, and and there's the broader community, but not each review is necessarily going to be fair.
How about the time and cognitive demand on students? How do we deal with that? It's been mentioned a few times now.
So there's I think a real trade-off. If you used to have 7 rich assignments and then only you graded them, and now you won't be able to do 7 assignments with peer assessment. There's just no way that that's going to work out. And I also felt that tension, but I liked that assignment, and what about that one? You really have to reframe around the peer giving feedback process as a real learning opportunity, and maybe even a stronger learning opportunity, so that it's you got to make friends with the idea that there will be fewer things and you spend more time on it, really chewing on it.
I'd say also, like what Phoebe had mentioned about valuing it, and I think the way we value it is by making room for it, and that I've had to, in order to do this, I've had to remove some other assessments or some other work to make room for it, because it really is a significant workload on the students, but is worth that, and more worth it than other assessments.
And building on what Chris and Michael said, I think it's important the student gets a lot out of it. But if they can see, like, if there's some sort of scaffold which quantifies how much feedback they're going to give, then they can kind of set their mind to, okay, I'm going to be giving these 2 types, and then I'm done. And it doesn't overwhelm them with their assignment as well. It's, I think, important to have that bit of structure, because the students often like referencing back and being, okay, like, what do I need? What's expected of me?
I like the comparison component of this. I think that that 2 of us have mentioned that when the students are working together on something, and then they go and they have the capacity to see and to compare their work to others, that it lessens the cognitive load on the group in general, in terms of actually being able to have a few examples to actually compare their own work to, as well as actually the project that they're evaluating. And so that capacity also, I think, is important, because it means that they're able to respond more effectively, but then also that they can trust their own judgments a little bit, which I think actually lessens the cognitive load in relation to the overall assignment.
There's a question from Louise here. When peer assessment is used for grading, how do students respond to knowing other students are affecting their grade? Okay, so that almost goes back to a question that was asked of you, Chris.
It's I remember an interview we did with a student almost 10 years ago, and they said, I got great feedback from my peers. I feel pretty good about the feedback I gave my peers. I didn't feel like I was giving bad advice. I was pretty clear. I put some work into it. I felt good about that. The scores that I gave were reasonable. The scores that I received are reasonable. And yet it is totally unreasonable that my score produced their grade. That, it wasn't that the numbers were off. It's just that it's not a property that I as a student should have to be able to produce grades. So this thing around grades is kind of interesting and separate from whether the numbers happen to be correct or not correct. And I think allowing students to, ask for a regrade, including algorithms that, like Perceptive does, that downweights students who appear to be not taking the task seriously, that starts to add confidence around this grading thing. But for sure, if you emphasize the grading side, and by making it count for a ton of points, or just not valuing the formative side, then students start getting nervous. It's a pretty different practice. And at University of Pittsburgh, for a while, even though I created the system, it was banned because undergraduates are not allowed to grade other undergraduates. And we had to have a whole conference where we brought in outside experts to convince the dean that he should let this go.
I can try to tackle this one as well, since my use of compare was more summative, even though it can be used for both. And so, yeah, some of students' grades were sort of being, brought up by their peers. However, I always, really try to get students on my side by explaining what's happening. I can easily win them over that way for the most part, if I tell them why I'm doing it, how it works. And I did, with my usage, assure them that your peer's not necessarily going to say your project is a 4.5 out of 5. I'm going to do that. but they're going to provide the feedback and sort of give me a sense of the quality of the submissions. That's kind of what I pitched it as, and it was okay. That said, I haven't yet done this project where students had to do it. It was like part of their overall course grade. It was optional, and they could get some of their quiz mark replaced with this assignment. And so it might be a different scenario if every student had to do it. Probably some chose it because there was a peer assessment component. In my instance, in this class, we didn't have a huge peer assessment, going on the whole term. And in the other times when I have used peer assessment for science writing, which is to really mimic that peer review process, we haven't used it for grades in that way, that summative way. It's more like we do attach a little bit of a grade for doing the peer review. We do attach some grade to having you incorporate the feedback. So there might be a worksheet that students do that they explain why they incorporated the peer feedback and why they didn't. So there's a grade on that part, but not for the assessment itself. But I think you can get students on your side if you really want to do it for a certain reason. Try it and just really explain to them in an upbeat way why you're doing it, and you might be surprised.
Chris, there was a question about peer assessment versus self-assessment. And I know there's quite a bit of research into that. Are you able to summarize? Is it summarizable?
Yeah, well, both depend upon the sensibility of the rubric. Like, is it student sensible? You're asking students to make judgments, and if the rubric is terrible, turns out even experts have low reliability if you give them a terrible rubric. They're either similar, both are found positive, and sometimes there's a slight leg up for self-assessment in the meta-analyses, but that's in part because people often do a low accountability version of peer assessment, and then you get comments that are awesome, dude, short, generic positives. You need to use some kind of structure that gets students away from short, generic positives. And then peer assessment and self-assessment are both similar and positive for learning.
I'm not sure I actually mentioned, did I, that Chris, you created Peerceptive that Michael's using?
Yes.
This is correct.
It was a group effort in the end. I created the first version, and now it's like version 20 or something like that. And a big team contributed, and now a big team runs in all the updates. I also, when I use it, I log in, I'm like, oh, look at all these features. Glad the team added these things.
There's a question here from Ivan, and it's related kind of to this initial effort from teachers about creating rubrics and how much work it is to create the rubric. Do we need to customize for each activity, or can you use something more generic or perhaps more holistic? Does anyone want to?
I wouldn't say holistic, but I would say making the rubrics reflect the generalizable skills that you want. What you want student to be able to do on another assignment and another assignment, what's going to carry over, and having the dimensions attend to that thing that will carry over is helpful. But one can think of these rubrics as having a two-parter. One is language that's the general, and then some, for example, in this assignment, it looks like this, that acts as an additional scaffold so students know what you're talking about here. So you might have a general thing that you reuse, and then you like tweak it a little bit to add some details as it applies to the current assignment. And a lot of the systems that are out there have like a library of rubrics that you can search through and build upon. So you don't have to sit there, you know, tabula rasa blank, while you can build, stand on each other's shoulders and get to good places.
I'd offer that just as I say, I come to the grading process with a long history of being a holistic grader and actually learning, you know, the art of making rubrics has been, you know, has been an important development in my own professional development as a teacher. And then, you know, how can I put it? Getting feedback from the system on how well this, you know, how reliable it is, how well it's working is a process in which I'm learning to sharpen my skills on that. But it's something that learning not to try and put your holistic decision tree in sort of rubric form has been is a process for me. So, but the reliability of that rubric, it just to see that happen as the students start cluing in on what you're getting as over the course of the semester, that is it really is encouraging.
I'll just add that I think if you are going to grade the students' work with a rubric, it's really valuable for students to understand that rubric and to potentially have practice applying it. As we've been discussing, that can be challenging because getting that reliability of, you know, if you have numbers, what's a 3 or what's satisfactory and what's not is really challenging. And I will say that was one of the primary drivers driving people who developed Compare. Let's not even do that. There's an alternative way, which is if you can explain the dimension on which you want the students to compare the two works and then get them to do that a few times, it's quite reliable. So there's another way. I'm not against rubrics. I use them. I think they're great and you can build them off each other's and tailor them how you want. But I think this different approach of really simplifying it and having students look at the deep features of whatever kind of product is in front of them is likely to be helpful to learning as well. But you do need to give them some guidance. So I think the default comparison is in Compare is which one's, but on what, right? You might want to like make that sentence a little bit longer. And then you'll see with the project that I did, I gave them a few things to consider. And then of course, without giving them weights of which one of those things should rank higher, they still need to make a decision. But doing that a few times ends up okay. So, yeah.
If I may add, sorry, just a quick, the way we go about it, and again, our process is very loose. And I think Liz at some point mentioned this idea of students developing the rubrics as the process goes on. We basically said, tell us why it's right and tell us why it's wrong, or tell me this is right because and this is wrong because. And then from there, they have many different things that they can look at and explain the right and the wrong.
Can I just build on that? We have a study that's just about to come out. Those explanations, the like, not just the evidence, you know, this is what was good and this was what bad, but the because element turns out to be the best predictor of learning. So, you know, we used to have generic instructions about let's make sure your comments are specific and constructive. And constructive is good, like suggestions for how to improve, but explanations are even better, both for the recipient and for the provider. So I highly recommend pushing students to add explanations into their comments.
I also just wanted to add to on what everyone's been saying is rubrics are hard. And when you're first implementing the process, you're going to have something, but you'll find that it will evolve as you see what your students are saying in response, because with any new thing, you don't know how they're going to respond. You don't know how your course is going to fit in with it. And rely on your students, like see what they say and kind of what benefits them and what doesn't work as much. And then you can always cut in your next semesters and build upon it to make it stronger.
So I just wanted to add about in relation to the formative versus summative and qualitative versus the grading and the rubrics component of it. I think I found that providing that qualitative, I think there is a cap on the number of revisions that you can do, and there is a shelf life on how many times it's useful to answer that question. And there is a point at which giving the qualitative feedback and talking about that constructive feedback and the because component that you bring in, Chris, that actually does get students used to and more confident in being able to do that. But when they actually get like as a follow-up, an organized rubric in relation to it, they're more familiar with the language associated with it, and they're more familiar with some of the criteria perhaps, because they've become used to actually being able to have to articulate some of it themselves in relation to the content and the course itself. And so I think that's also useful in terms of actually building capacity or their familiarity with rubrics and understanding the role of assessment and the role of like giving that feedback and being able to use those criteria, because very often they'll come up with those criteria themselves. And I think this is the relationship between people talk about building the rubrics throughout through the qualitative versus like actually providing students with a rubric. I do both. And so they do these qualitative comments and then they have a rubric at the end of it, but they're more used to actually the process in relation to it. And they're like as part of the experience of providing those comments to other students. And so I find that useful in relation to thinking about the like qualitative and formative versus summative.
So there was a question here about logistics, which is perfect timing because we're drawing near 4 o'clock and it's also the last challenge that we had listed. Specifically, it was mentioned this idea of an initial training session and also using exemplars.
Multiple systems have training, calibrated peer review, the real one, not the fake one that Coursera claims they have. It was sort of famous for that training phase. And now a number of systems have that, and you can create a training object where you sort of seed. Unbeknownst to them, one of the documents to evaluate was chosen to be strong and 2 were weak in interestingly different ways. And you get students to all go through reviewing that, and then you can have a shared conversation because everyone looked at the same things around that. So that is a pretty productive way of beginning.
If no one else has anything to say, I just wanted to add, in terms of your question was saying a training initial phase. We've used visual classrooms now for about 3 semesters. And our last semester, we started introducing kind of the peer assessment. And from the survey, we kind of found that people were kind of off-footed at the beginning because they weren't exactly sure how to use the platform. So this semester, we've implemented kind of like a home base where they were able to go and just get familiar with kind of the different icons, like how to post a file, how to post their photo of their drawing of a molecule, just so that when we start doing the formative assignments, they're kind of already on like the right footing and they're not like thrown off. And we found that it was really helpful in terms of building the community too, because we had just like simple posts of like introduce yourself on the platform. So especially now with COVID and everything online, you kind of get to know more of those people in your classroom. So it's not just unknowns giving you feedback. You kind of have like a reference point. So we did find that the initial training phase did help through the semester.
Are we going for Liz's question in the chat?
The digital platform, that's interesting. I think it's important to have a shared space that people can bridge both in the classroom and any of the assignments done and the work that is done that can be referenced within the class itself, as well as outside of the classroom, that's easily accessible and that students can add content to in both contexts. And so, yeah, a digital tool, like just where you have some sort of technology where students can share, whether they can actually, I found it does make a big difference to be able to bring in visual components to it, as well as for students to be able to have kind of a sandbox where they can play around with some of the tools themselves, as well as the ways of presenting and adding material. And so anything that can do that, I find incredibly useful, and where people can actually see each other's work and, essentially add to the same document or the same platform, or this is why I like Span, because it does have this great interface in relation to thinking about that shared space.
Yeah, this is why I like visual classrooms, because it's exactly what it does. People can add to each other's posts. People can comment on each other's posts. People give feedback to each other's posts. People can see posts from only their group or everybody else, and I get to see again everything. So it's yeah, it works. It works very well for peer assessment.
Yeah, and I'll just take on another angle on it. Rather than the open nature, sometimes providing that anonymity behind reviews allows, with the teacher, of course, having God mode and can see if there's anything inappropriate. But having that anonymity through the digital platform can allow, some interesting comments that they might be a little more reticent to make to a student. How can I put it? It can be hard to criticize the smart person in your group if they're aware of that. And I say just in terms of managing the workflow, in my case, I would not be able to do this more than sort of once a semester if I had to sort of photocopy a pile of papers and distribute them. And the fact that it's digital, I think Chris mentioned it, it makes it possible to do these kinds of things that I've been doing.
It's 4:01 now, and I believe we have, Sue, do we have a form for feedback for this webinar that you want to give to the group? I think
yes, I will actually send that in the chat right now.
Okay, so Sue's going to just post it. If you can provide us feedback, we'd really appreciate it. It will help us decide what to do in future seminars. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. It's a very impressive turnout, and we really appreciate it, and a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much to all our presenters. Thank you, Chris, for coming all the way from Pittsburgh. Much appreciated.
I'm heading back to the airport, flying back now.
All right, be safe.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
This has been fantastic. If anybody wants to stick around for two more seconds, if you had some question to ask, feel free to stick around. I'm sure, Chris can probably hold that plane.
Yeah.
And we're also
and Jackie.
And we're also sending a survey along with some materials, resources from this webinar to all of you.
Yeah, just talking from my own personal experience of this webinar, I can't say enough about how wonderful I thought it went. I think it was it's extremely informative, and I hope that everyone who is here got something meaningful out of the event. I certainly did. I felt I learned along with you, and I felt that it had a sense of the kind of flow that you have when you are with people, as opposed to being just talked at. So thank you for making that possible by the way that you presented. I really appreciate it.
Lovely. Thanks for encouraging that format.
So any last questions for anyone? Any comments? I have a comment. I mean, I always want more. So I'm thinking that probably, you've mentioned a lot of things about peer feedback, a lot of things about rubrics. I'm thinking that that might be something that maybe not the topic of a full-blown webinar with close to 80 people at one point in time. Maybe it's like a smaller group gathering about how do we do this kind of work. Or it could be bigger, but it could be that we delve more deeply into that process, because it seems like when we were preparing this the webinar, we were learning and feeling more and more that we have underestimated the value of peer assessment because it does such high level, meta level things. So it's the only time that you can see your students thinking about their thinking or thinking about how they structure the work that they have to evaluate somebody else's work, which is really and truly reflecting on how they think about their own work, right? So it's quite remarkable. It only came about at this point that I feel like I've thought about a lot of these approaches for a long time, but it's only in this past week that I've realized how valuable this particular approach is.
I feel that it's not even like a family of approaches. There needs to be a bigger word for there's so many elements, so many ways of doing it, so many aspects of it that you kind of, you can look at it anew each time and see yet another interesting element of it, and having a community talk with examples of, it worked well in this way, and then I see another thing. It just seems there's a lot of opportunity for growth as a community around this.
You said the magic word, Chris. I know that Jackie will say, "Uh-oh, I heard Martha say this." Liz will tag you now as you're one of us. So anybody who wants to delve more deeply into that, maybe Chris, that's a wonderful challenge or opportunity that you produce. That you've given us, that we could possibly have a small group of interested people looking more deeply at this, and and maybe find ways to build our resources together. So that's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad others are potentially interested, because it's a very concrete thing to share. I had this assignment, here was my rubric, here are some comments. You can dig into that relatively quickly and see very interesting things in each other's situations.
Super. Bruno?
Well, I don't have much to say, but I'm really grateful for that. I think that we're looking at University of Montreal. Well, Chris, I'm a full professor in education at University of Montreal. I'm also responsible of the Teaching and Learning Center there. And we are looking at an area of development in Moodle in which we really want to upscale peer assessment, and actually any kind of technology supported enriched ratings or formative, either formative or summative evaluation. We just implemented something which is well, I'm looking for the English word. It's script, formative script. It's by Bernard Chardin, who's a medicine, but we're looking at the area of how technology can enrich feedback supplied by either peers or teachers. And it can take multiple forms. So I'd say we're at an early stage in that process, but exploiting peer assessment possibilities is a first stage that is really a no-brainer, and we haven't done much into that area. And I look at science teacher, biology teachers, psychology teachers, a lot of them mainly use 3 hours lecture plus multiple choices questions. So very basically, we have to find a way of getting them to move from there, see the richness, and also giving them an option that is manageable for, and that doesn't mean that, and some of them have 400 students classes. That's also another part of the reality. So anyway, so that's a little bit the picture, but I was really I really appreciate the format, Liz, the expertise, the practical. I think it works really fine. It's the first time since a long time I spent 2 hours actually seated and invested in the webinar I'm attending. So I just want to say hi to everyone and share my appreciation.
Thank you, Bruno.
So thank you, and this is a wonderful time to thank all of you on the panel, and a particular big thanks to Phoebe, because you did a marvelous job of animating, you know, and setting the stage. And anyone else who wants to say a goodbye, you know, or Chris, if you wanted to respond to Bruno. But we definitely, I mean, Bruno, you will open up more opportunities for us to look at how we can move forward together. This is wonderful.
Sure.
Yeah, the technology and peer side, we're just at the beginning of these conversations. The more that peer assessment gets implemented, the more that it's throwing off interesting data and text mining is just exploding as an area. So I'm sure in another 5 years, there will be amazing new things where we're using peer assessment as the primary source of learning about students from their assessment, the things they're producing. I think, you know, watch this space. Maybe Bruno will lead the way, but I'm sure there will be multiple groups doing exciting work in this area.
Well, I was thinking, Chris, during your presentation, I was thinking about the artificial intelligence used as agents to help students actually point out, you were pointing out explanations. There are simple things that could be trained to say, well, actually an intelligent agent may be able to train the raters in order to help them give better with simple rubrics. I think there might, do you think there might be some development in that area?
Yeah, actually I had a couple of projects focused, before I thought being specific and being constructive were the two important things. And so we built intelligent agents to say, I'm noticing that very few of your comments are not very specific. Or I'm noticing that you complained a lot, but you didn't give any advice. Could you revise your comments and add some more like that? So we were able to do that. And now I want to pivot to explanations, because this just came out in more recent research, to start adding automatic detectors for that. You know, it's like in the doable. It's not something you can do in 10 minutes. It takes a year of computer science research to build a general, you know, language is so expressive. There's so many ways that we can give an explanation, but, you know, eventually I think we'll be pretty good at that.
Just following up on that, Bruno, as you're mentioning it, I'm doing some few projects in AI and natural language processing and a few generative models. And I was, you know, thinking, you know, if we have a lot of data, one could start generating, you know, examples of poor constructions and good constructions as a further sort of amplification of the training phase. Just, you know, thinking out loud, so to speak. But as I think a fascinating, neat, a neat connection that you've identified there.
That's interesting. And we could use MOOC platforms to train because of the numbers. Actually, we have everyone, actually there are so many, everyone is in Moodle now with the pandemic. We actually, everyone's at the distance. So we don't even have to go with MOOCs.
You can also do natural language looking across courses as more and more courses are doing this. You can see when rubrics look more like this, there tends to be more student growth. And when rubrics look more like that, there tends to be less student growth. And so we can do the text mining across courses, not just within courses.
That's interesting.
So clearly we have lots of future conversations and places to move. So I'm going to say, because people probably feel a little guilty leaving, I'll do the closing down and say thank you again. Thank you, Sue and Janaea as our office people, and thank you to the panel. You have been terrific. Very very enriching. A great big thank you to Alice's student, Chloe, who is the young one on the panel, and did a fantastic job. We all should have undergrads like that. And thank you all. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for.